Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have with us Jomo Kwame Sundaram today. Jomo is a Malaysian economist, extremely prolific writer. He's been Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations for Economic Development and has been Assistant Director General at FAO and Coordinator for Economic and Social Development at FAO. Uh, Jomo Jomo's interests are again very wide reaching. He's worked on political economy of globalization, on uh, global finance, on various aspects of macroeconomy, as well as on other issues such as food security, on nutrition. He was the man behind the Second International Conference of Nutrition and has been an advocate on the whole question of sort of crucial linkages between food systems and nutrition and so on. So, Jomo's worked on a very wide range of things. Welcome, Jomo. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Uh, we will start the lecture. The lecture, you can take about 45 minutes, and then we will have questions. Audience, join us over YouTube, and I'll be happy to read out their questions after you've finished. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Vikas, and thank you to SSER and Ideas for inviting me to deliver this lecture. What I would like to do is really not terribly economic. What I hope to do over the next few minutes is to try to look at a number of experiences in order for us to draw some lessons about how this epidemic has affected many of our societies, and how different types of policy responses have been formulated. And essentially, I will talk a little bit about the political economy, more the politics rather than the economics of it. And this is what I intend to do. Let me first begin by highlighting the differences in responses, particularly in relation to the early history of this epidemic. As you know, the virus is believed to have first become significant in Wuhan, and really the industrial capital of China from the early part of the 20th century, if not earlier. And the crisis, the virus, was identified as being quite different from earlier viruses. Initially, there was a belief that it was just another viral outbreak, another flu, and so on. But some of the early doctors who recognized the differences involved were, as you know, suppressed by local authorities in Wuhan. And this obviously had very important implications. And when the national authorities in Beijing learned about this, they quickly intervened to correct the situation, sent a team to investigate the situation, and reported it to the WHO at the end of last year. So this is very important for me to emphasize because, as you know, there's a great deal of fake news coming out of many sources and propagated not insignificantly by Indian media sources, but also by Australian, US, Japanese, and other sources. So the reporting was done to the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the World Health Organization and the Chinese authorities provided the sequencing virus fairly early on, less than 2 weeks later. This was available to the whole world and enabled a number of analyses to be developed fairly quickly. As is the case with any multilateral organization, there's a protocol to be followed. And eventually, at the end of January, about 4 weeks later, the WHO declared it an epidemic of international significance. This is actually the most important declaration because the subsequent declaration of it as a pandemic in March really has no operational significance. It has no significance in terms of the protocols of the WHO. So it is the declaration at the end of January. And it should be emphasized that the WHO did not immediately make that declaration. It is not in a position to do so. It's an intergovernmental organization. And it was done after some investigation. Teams were sent to China and so on and so forth. Now, the reason for saying this, all this is because, as you know, there are now claims that all this information was ostensibly suppressed by the Beijing authorities, causing a great deal of grief and so on and so forth. Now, different countries have responded to the crisis very differently. And it's very important for us to recognize that particularly in East Asia, but also I want to emphasize in Kerala state in southwestern India, there were very important early precautionary measures taken. And this is important for us to recognize because by contrast, people have forgotten that the response in much of the rest of the world was actually quite different. Many people, for example, took the view that it was a virus which was peculiarly Chinese or Southeast Asian or East Asian and did not pose a threat to the rest of the world. Another view, of course, was that the virus should be allowed to run its course, develop, and in the process of doing so, populations would develop a so-called herd mentality, meaning that the populations would develop a certain natural immunity to the virus. Now, all this was especially significant in the West, particularly in the Anglophone West. And we in the former British colonies are very, very susceptible to these types of influences. So the reason for saying so is because the policy in the UK, for instance, only changed after Imperial College of London published its study in mid-March, which suggested that over 1% of the UK population would die if that approach continued to be maintained. As you know, Sweden and a number of other countries continue to maintain what they call a herd immunity approach. Although it has to be emphasized that it is not strictly a herd immunity approach, because particularly vulnerable populations, the older people particularly, are effectively quarantined in this amended herd immunity approach. Now, coming back to the virus itself, what is significant about this virus is that it is much more infectious than many other viruses, although it should be emphasized that the mortality rate is lower. Of those infected, less people will die compared to, say, SARS-1, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which occurred around 2008. But one of the big problems with the virus is that it does not lend itself to immediate detection. So the existing tests, especially during the first two or 3 months of this year, the existing tests could only identify the virus after about 5 days. There was another test which was much cheaper, which many developing countries have adopted, which has been available, which identifies which can confirm whether or not a person is positive only after about twice that period, somewhere between about 10 to 14 days. This is when antibodies are to be found in the human body concerned. So the first test somebody could be identified as being positive after the antigens begin to develop, and that is after at least 5 days or so. There are now new tests which have not been universally recommended, but which the Chinese and others are promoting, or at least some Chinese are promoting, which are able to identify the virus presence as soon as somebody is infected. And this, the level of accuracy appears to be quite high, and it may be relatively soon when people will be able to adopt this. Now, it's important to state this because there are many people would say, for example, that there have been a lot of conspiracies where Saddam Hussein talked about a US originated coronavirus and so on and so forth. Coronaviruses have been identified in science since the 1950s at least. So the fact that there's mention of a coronavirus in itself is not significant. One of the recent developments, which is quite important, is that there are apparently at least 3 different strains which are geographically distributed rather peculiarly. And the strain B is the one which is said to be in China. Strain A is said to be in the US and in a number of other places, or North America. And the strain C is the one which has been very lethal, particularly in Italy. Now, another important development, recent development, is the recognition that the virus has been appears to have spread unevenly in different parts of the world. There's a lot of speculation why this is the case. People are suggesting that the DNA of different populations in the world may be part of the reason. Others suggest that the temperature and weather is a factor, and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of speculation. And there's also a great deal of speculation about possible cures, or at least possible palliatives. And this is, again, has given rise to a great deal of speculation. In India, for example, Indian doctors and others touting cures, including homeopathic doctors, are quite influential in other parts of the world, such as my own country, Malaysia. But I think it is important to acknowledge that there is no agreed cure as such, and more importantly, there is no vaccine which has been developed yet for this particular virus. There are different groups which have been working on a vaccine, and it is quite possible that there may be a breakthrough, but I think the protocol still requires a great deal. Protocols nowadays are being accelerated with the use of artificial intelligence and big data analysis, but still they will require a considerable amount of time before a vaccine will be generally available. Of course, there is also concern that the vaccine may be privately owned. Intellectual property rights may be asserted. And this is a very contentious area because, as you know, there are people who would insist that naturally occurring materials, sometimes termed biologics, should not be subject to property rights. But this is a contentious area, and there are a number of recent trade agreements which include biologics and which allow biologics to be rights to be asserted. So, for instance, if the cost of insulin, which is naturally occurring in animals, can be significantly raised if these kinds of rights are asserted successfully by pharmaceutical companies and so on. So this challenge really raises a whole host of issues which are extremely important for us to recognize. Yet another issue which is of interest to primarily economic audience is the fact that one cannot see this crisis as being one which can be addressed simply in terms of a fiscal stimulus, for instance. We are talking about a crisis which has been massively disruptive from what might be termed the supply side, and this, of course, has very important implications. And the recommendation and requirements in many instances of so-called physical distancing or social distancing, as some would have it, or safe distancing, as others would have it, will basically introduce a whole range of restrictions, particularly in terms of social interactions, and particularly on the delivery of quite a number of care services. So I think the implications there of all this are very important. The major disruptions which have been introduced by lockdowns in a number of societies has been massively disruptive, particularly for those who were reliant on daily sources of income. Casual workers usually in many societies, but also daily rated workers even in more formal employment. And then, of course, there are the problems of posed for petty businesses, particularly micro businesses. But it should be emphasized that questions of credit supply lines and a whole range of related matters have a huge effect on all businesses. Some more than others, of course, and depending on the nature of the business, the nature of the credit supply line, and so on and so forth. So even the recommendations of people who subscribe to modern monetary theory of using unconventional monetary measures would have important limitations, especially when you have a situation which defies the usual understanding of crisis. So this, I think, by way of setting the scene, is very important for us to recognize. Now, let me go back to the initial distinction I made between what has happened in East Asia and Kerala and what has happened in much of the rest of the world. This is a particularly important distinction because, unfortunately, there's a great deal of confusion, and many do not make this distinction, and this has affected much of the discussion about measures. So, basically, it is sometimes said that the reason East Asian countries and Kerala responded differently is because of their recent experiences with viral outbreaks. And this, of course, is a factor which cannot be dismissed entirely, which is quite important. I should emphasize, however, that because of the early suppression of the information, and also because of ignorance, because we are dealing with a completely new phenomenon. There was some delay in Wuhan city. And it is because it is a major industrial city, one has to recognize that the three surrounding provinces all supply labor on a daily basis to Wuhan city. And so the impact of the viral outbreak was felt not just in Wuhan city proper, but also in the surrounding provinces. So you basically had a lockdown in China, which affected not only Wuhan, but also the three surrounding provinces. But the rest of the Chinese provinces were not subjected to a lockdown. And this is very important to emphasize because the WHO committee, which was fact-finding committee, which was sent to China at a very early stage, made very, very important determinations. They emphasized that the Chinese success, meaning success in containing the outbreak for most of China was precisely because of what might be termed early action measures, quick and early action measures. In other words, the rest of the country was basically urged to take a number of actions. Now, let me point out one nuance which is very important, and that is, in China, it is traditional for workers to have two major breaks. One is during the month of October, which is often referred to as the golden month, and the other is at the time of the Lunar New Year. So what did happen in China was that as the Chinese authorities were trying to deal with this new situation, they extended the one week break, the usual Lunar New Year 1 week break, to 2 weeks. And it is the first 2 weeks from the 1st to the 15th, which are considered particularly dangerous. So this was not considered to be a very, very major disruption. For the rest of the country, outside of those 3 provinces, it is important to emphasize that there was no lockdown. It didn't mean nothing was done. A great number of early action measures were undertaken. And it is the speed with which authorities responded, which the WHO's fact-finding emphasizes, was what made the difference. Okay. Now, you have any number of people, both from the left and the right, who are basically emphasizing that the responses to the crisis would potentially give rise to totalitarian or authoritarian responses. And one should recognize that in most of the world today, it is the ethno-populists, as I term them, generally right-wing, who are in ascendance. It is not progressive forces who are in ascendance. So the fact that progressive forces have generally responded to the crisis reasonably well does not mean that most authorities will necessarily adopt these measures with democratic sensibilities in mind. Also, some of our more progressively minded friends have called for extraordinary wartime measures and in dealing with this crisis. And this is particularly important for us to consider very carefully, because as we have already seen, quite a number of right-wing populist regimes have already used this as a pretext for rather repressive measures. Now, let me then go to the case of Korea. In Korea, Korea had the second highest rate of infection after China, and second highest death rate in the early weeks of the outbreak. Part of the high level of incidence of infections and death was due to a secretive religious cult operating in a city called Daegu in Korea. And this accounts for a great number of infections in the Korean case. Although the Koreans responded to the outbreak in a number of ways which are important for us to recognize, but are very difficult for many other developing countries to emulate because of their high cost. Basically, the Korean mantra, if you will have it, was test, test, test. Okay, and so you have very high level of testing, and until a few weeks ago, Korea had the highest level of testing in the world. Now it has been exceeded by overtaken by Norway and a number of other countries. But until recently, Korea had the highest level of testing. So there was a mass testing, and basically, but the testing was accompanied by tracing. Okay, so where there were confirmed infections, it was a number of a number of measures were taken to try to trace the so-called primary contacts. In other words, people who had had face-to-face contacts with the infected person during the period of likely infection. And this tracing has been done very, very effectively. And Korea has been very careful in terms of ensuring that privacy was also maintained. I want to emphasize also that this was the case, has been the case in Vietnam. Vietnam has also been very, very careful about identifying patients by numbers rather than by name, except in one case. And that was a high-level official whom the Vietnamese government wanted to use as an example of how they were going to be even-handed in terms of their treatment. In other words, just because it was a high-level official, the high-level official was not going to get away with the breach of the strict measures which the Vietnamese introduced. So, just to reiterate now, in the case of both Korea as well as in the Vietnam and a number of other cases in East Asia, there was no strict lockdown measures. Lockdown being understood as stay in shelter measures. Okay, so Korea, as we know, successfully reversed and has done what is called flattening the curve. I don't know whether everybody understands flattening the curve, but let me just take a moment to explain what the term it refers to. It is generally recognized that the different societies and different countries are differently prepared to cope with the major crisis which COVID-19 poses. And the idea of flattening the curve is to try to reduce the number of infections and the number of deaths, particularly infections, so that the national health system is able to cope with it. And so the idea is to reduce the number of infections, flatten the curve, so to speak. We do know that if completely left to its unchecked, that the virus is likely to spread almost exponentially. This was the case in China, and part of the reason why the Chinese authorities decided on the lockdown measures in the 3 provinces surrounding Wuhan city. In the case of Korea, the determination was made that through mass testing and also tracing and treatment of patients, as well as other measures such as requiring the use of face masks, as well as other types of physical distancing, the matter could be handled without a lockdown. So the same thing happened in Vietnam, except in Vietnam, in a couple of so-called communes. Okay, communes. I'm not sure what the Indian equivalent would be, but a commune is an area, a defined geographical area, usually around a village community and so on and so forth. So in a number of communes in Vietnam, probably 2 or 3 out of hundreds, there have been very, very strict lockdowns. In other words, this is a time when targeting is important, targeting works, and targeting has been shown to work. So you basically, by having a lockdown in a localized area, you are basically effectively almost quarantining that area. Okay, and so it is very important to recognize that very simple measures, such as those measures which have been adopted in many parts of the world, including Kerala state, which is a relatively poor state, have been very effective in terms of checking the spread of the virus. Now, let me, having said something about China and having said something about Korea and Vietnam, and I don't want to talk about Kerala because you're all very familiar. Let me contrast what has happened there with 2 very, very different cases in Latin America. In Latin America, we have in the form of Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, a man who I once described him as out-trumping Trump himself. Okay, he outdoes Trump in many ways, which I don't have time to discuss right now. But the most important thing is that to emphasize about the political response of Bolsonaro has been he has basically dismissed the COVID-19 as anything more than a flu virus. And he basically says that all the fuss is really a creation of the media. Meanwhile, however, the infections are rising have been rising in Brazil, in Sao Paulo city, for example, or Sao Paulo state, sorry, which is the state around Sao Paulo city. There have now been new cemeteries which have been designated and opened, and excavators are working around the clock to dig graves, expecting a major continued increase in the number of deaths. Importantly, from a political point of view, Bolsonaro has been at odds with his governors. Okay, the governors are usually from other political parties, not necessarily his own political party, and he has been basically fighting with all the governors. And quite incredibly, about 2 weeks ago, he called for a coup against his own government. Now, you might see that as very, he's really out-trumping Trump, but there's a method to this apparent madness. And Bolsonaro is basically wanting a coup to strengthen centralized authority. So he expects to continue to be in charge after the coup, and he called for this coup against his government, against his own government, when addressing a crowd in front of the army headquarters. Okay, so you have incredible behavior and very little attempt to engage with the states, very little attempt to try to develop a common national strategy, and apparently perverse behavior of calling a coup against his own government. Contrast that with what has happened in the case of Argentina. Argentina has seen the election at the end of last year of Alberto Fernandez, who was finance minister under the previous Cristina Fernandez Kirchner government of the Peronist party. Fernandez became president in December last year, and basically inherited a huge economic mess. Economy in recession, inflation exceeding 50%, poverty rate exceeding 40%, and the currency falling by more than 60% over the course of 2019. So as soon as he came in, he announced two things. One, he was going to try to improve the fiscal balance by increasing taxation. And secondly, he was going to try to renegotiate the sovereign debt, the foreign debt. And negotiations started. In March, that means slightly under 2 months ago, Argentina became the first Latin American country to declare, the president decreed that there would be a state of emergency, a public health emergency in Argentina. The number of infections in Argentina are high, and they have not come down as much as in the other countries I have been talking about, except for Brazil, of course. But what is important and interesting about Argentina is the very, very different approach which Argentina has adopted. So on the one hand, I wanted to highlight three elements. First, the government has engaged with others in authority, others in power. So what does this mean? He has engaged with all the governors, and he has engaged with all the political parties. In fact, when he declared the public health emergency, he declared it in the presence. There was a show of unity of all the political parties in the spectrum, okay, including the party which he had just defeated at the end of last year. A show of unity by all the political parties. This was seen as a national effort and portrayed as a national effort. All the governors have been closely consulted on measures to be taken, and relief measures have been introduced. The relief measures, I want to emphasize, are probably as progressive in some ways as what Kerala has done. I should emphasize that in most countries, although there are relief measures, it would be an exaggeration to say that they have been biased towards the most vulnerable. But in Argentina, there is a great sensitivity towards the most vulnerable, and although the measures undertaken in Argentina have been quite different from what we see in Kerala, there has been that kind of sensitivity. So the two elements so far are, one, an all of government approach. Okay, an all of government approach, meaning involving all levels of government, the federal government, the central government, as well as the state governments, as well as the entire spectrum of the cabinet. Okay, so the planning for the measures and so on and so forth has involved the entire cabinet, not just the health authorities and so on. By the way, the previous government had demoted the health minister, who was no longer in the cabinet. This was restored by Fernandez. And then the second measure, of course, is the pro vulnerable measures, relief measures which have been introduced. The third element, which I think is very important and interesting for other developing countries, is the fact that, again, a second display of national unity. Fernandez, together with the other political leaders, they came out together and said that, and insisted on new terms for sovereign debt. Okay, so sovereign debt has been negotiated. The government has come out. Martin Repeto, some of you may have read some of his articles, who's now the economy minister. There's no finance minister, it's called the economy minister. He has defined new terms which are far, far less onerous than the previous Macri had agreed to. As you may remember, the Macri government was obsessed with trying to be acceptable in international financial markets and so on. So Repeto's and Fernandez government has done very differently. So we have seen how the crisis has also provided an opportunity for the Argentine government to renegotiate the debt situation in their case. So what can we say by way of conclusion? What is quite clear, it seems to me, is that early action, quick early action, adequate quick early action has actually been very successful in most countries in East Asia which have adopted that. There is one important exception which I need to acknowledge, and that is the island state of Singapore, where they have seen a resurgence of the virus because they ignored the migrant worker situation. Singapore has a huge share of migrant workers, many of whom from the subcontinent, but also from elsewhere. And many of them lived in very cramped housing, dormitory housing. And they became, and they are also involved in many of the 3D jobs, dirty jobs, dangerous jobs, and so on and so forth, and often work in old age homes and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that we find that resurgence, which has been traced largely to the migrant workers. And so this has, of course, raised a lot of concern in other countries which have large migrant worker populations, including my own country. But I think what is important to recognize is that, with the exception of Singapore, early adequate precautionary measures have been very successful, even in China. Even in China. The lockdown was the exception in China because it was necessitated by the earlier lack of transparency of the municipal authorities in suppressing the information of the initial viral outbreak. Once the federal authorities, or national authorities, central authorities learned of this, they have reversed the situation, and the rest, I think, is all quite familiar to you. Now, so I basically would like to urge many of you, as you think about what to recommend, that the way of posing the problem in terms of a choice between life and the economy is actually a wrong way of posing the problem, because the economy is not just the economy it's not just the big companies, it's also livelihoods of the vast majority of the people in our countries. And so unless there are enough measures taken to compensate them, and it's usually beyond the fiscal means of many countries, even if they are willing to do so, then we are basically saying the choice is between lives and livelihoods, which is a very, very difficult choice. Having said that, the design of what is done during the lockdown it becomes extremely important. If you simply have, for example, use the lockdown to restrict movements and expect the problem to go away, it's simply not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. You have to do tracing, you need community support, you need community cooperation for that. And if you don't have that community cooperation, if you do not have transparency where the community feels that they can trust the authorities, that the information they're getting from the authorities is reliable, and if they don't feel a certain sense of security provided by relief measures, as in Kerala or in Argentina, it is very unlikely that the population will be mobilized around and in support of the measures. So I think it is very important for us to very carefully about the design of measures in this connection. So because I think I've spoken for about 3/4 of an hour, I hope that is a useful introduction. I suspect I've gone over ground which is very familiar with for many of you, but I think it hopefully is a starting point for discussion and perhaps debate over some of these issues. So thank you very much for your attention.
Absolutely. Jomo, thank you very much. I'm sure this would allow us to have interesting discussion. Now, there are already some questions. We have essentially 3 sets of questions at the moment, but let's take them one by one. The first set of questions is about the whole issue of measurement, about what are the different reasons why there may be underreporting of infections, underreporting of deaths, and so on. So there's a question. There is a confusion about fatality rate. Method of counting corona deaths is being questioned on the basis of deaths with COVID versus deaths from COVID. Though infected deaths may happen due to comorbidities, heart attacks, and so on. What is your view of fatality rate of COVID-19 and issues about its measurement? Fatality rate, if measured only against tested cases, may be less or more depending on how many are tested. So there's a question of testing. How much do you test? So yeah, that's and then there is there are particularly, this is a question with reference to Malaysia. There have been reports of arrests of migrant workers in the name of COVID control in the past few weeks. Could the fear of coming forward for testing be undermining the actual number of cases? Yeah.
I thought there was a question.
Yeah, so the question is, to what extent there's underreporting of cases of infection and deaths, and what could be the causes of that in underreporting?
Okay, let me take the migrant worker issue first. I think there are unconfirmed reports that over 150 migrant workers who were in a special facility in Malaysia have disappeared. In other words, they have left the facility. This can be almost as bad as the tabligh. If these are all the 150 plus people, workers are all already infected, and we don't know that for sure, it is very likely that they would have disappeared. I generally I want to make 2 things quite clear about my personal position, but it says nothing about the government position. Firstly, I have called very early on, together with a number of others, but few, I must admit, very few others. We have called for 2 things as far as migrant workers are concerned. We've called for a general amnesty for migrant workers. Okay, just let me give you some quick figures, okay? The official size of the Malaysian labor force is 15 million, okay? About 2 million are documented foreign workers. In other words, and then the estimated number of foreign workers in the country is about 7 million. If you take the 2 million aside, we have about 5 million other undocumented foreign workers who are probably in the worst possible conditions, extremely difficult to trace, and so on and so forth. So what I called for, because I'm not sure I got any support, what I called for was a general amnesty. Okay, that all the foreign workers who are here illegally would get amnesty and they would be given documentation for at least 1 year. Okay, and the whole idea was that to normalize the situation and to provide some incentive for them to come forward. And then secondly, to related to that, for free testing and treatment. Unfortunately, the current Prime Minister, who came to power under very, basically there was a palace coup at the end of February, he had made a statement that foreign workers would be charged for testing. And this was basically contravening existing government policy. The government policy is that everybody is eligible for free medical treatment, and this has been abused undoubtedly by employers of foreign workers who basically do nothing for the foreign workers and send them to government facilities when it suits them. Now, because he was the Prime Minister had made this statement, nobody dared to contradict him. But as I said, this is really not official policy. Now, quite a number of people have been arrested for violating what is called the movement control order, which restricts movements during the period. The MCO, as it is called, was introduced in mid-March, and it basically was lifted on Monday, a few days ago. In other words, the MCO lasted for about 7 weeks. Okay, and so I suspect that, as I indicated earlier, the most vulnerable are those involved in petty businesses and those who are daily rated workers, a category which most migrant workers, especially the illegals, the undocumented workers, fall in. So, but this arrest has also affected a great number of Malaysians themselves, yeah, not just foreigners. In fact, most of the people arrested were actually Malaysians. Only recently has this arrest of foreigners taken place, and again, there has been much more criticism of the arrest of people contravening the MCO. There was guidance provided by the government that they should impose a fine, but this, of course, is not enforceable. Sentencing is left to the discretion of the magistrate, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, being in any kind of confined environment only exacerbates the problem. It worsens the problem. So what has been done has hardly been helpful. But to be quite honest, a lot of this is just simply not publicly available information. There's a lot of rumor mongering. The other matter which is of concern to me is there has been in recent weeks a major campaign against the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. And this campaign has become terrible. And this under the point I was making earlier. Usually, in such situations, it becomes very attractive for some politicians to blame the others, to blame the outsider, to blame the foreigner, to blame everybody but themselves, and the result, of course, has been hugely problematic. So I cannot confirm the questioners. I cannot tell you what the numbers are, but the information which has circulated on the social media is that about over 150 did leave those facilities. How many more continue to be confined? I have no idea. The fear, of course, is that many of these workers are living in very cramped circumstances, sometimes 2 people sharing a bed. Somebody who works the day shift sleeps at night, and then somebody else who's working the night shifts works in the day, and so on and so forth. Going back to the first question on the measurement, this measurement problem is a serious problem. There is the problem, as the questioner herself or himself implied, of comorbidities, and so even in the case of death, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what is happening. As the questioner said, there is a huge problem of we are only testing a small proportion in most developing countries, a very small proportion of the population. And as I suggested earlier, depending on the type of testing which is taking place, we may well be testing rather late and confirming infections rather late, and a great deal of damage can be done in the intervening period before the confirmation of infections. So all these raise problems, and I think it is a problem, to be raised. I don't know enough about the Indian situation to say anything which is terribly useful to most of your audience, but I do think that it is a huge problem in terms of measurement, in terms of assessment, and so on and so forth. Particularly for those who have respiratory and other pulmonary related issues, it is a major problem. And so for asthmatics and so on and so forth, one of the things which many Malaysians have often commented on is that during the period of the lockdown, air pollution receded quite a bit. The pollution of rivers adjoining close to factories also receded, and so there have been. So one could argue that in some ways there has been some improvement in the quality of life, at least as far as these indicators are concerned. But it is going back to the issue. It is a major issue, and there are no easy answers. Over to you.
Yeah, Jomo, there are a few questions about efficacy of containment measures. The response has been, the strictness of lockdowns has been varied across countries and different places. How effective are lockdowns and these containment measures, and how varied are the economic outcomes of this? Now, in the Indian context, you see, we've had lockdown for about 50 days now, and there is now some pressure, and there's some sort of move towards gradually lifting it. There's already sort of some steps have been taken in that direction. There's pressure to do more of that. But at the same time, as you were saying, there's been a period when the government has done pretty little to actually contain the spread of COVID infection. So you actually have the curve still going up and accelerating pretty rapidly, while there is already pressure to lift the lockdown. So, how effective is the lockdown, and what has been the comparative sort of experience in that respect?
Well, as we all know, there are. It is very difficult to. We are not comparing comparable things, right? Depending on whether or not you increase the amount of testing, you improve tracing, you improve a number of other factors which contribute to infection rates and fatality rates. There can be a great number of variables involved. The efficacy of lockdowns in many situations, such as India, I don't know whether those videos of policemen beating up all kinds of people are representative. But if lockdowns are essentially repressive in intent in terms of enforcing the lockdown, you may have a short-term success in terms of extending the of reducing the periods of reducing the amount of social interactions which are related to normal ordinary human behavior, depending on the nature of one's occupation and so on and so forth. Having said that, however, it's not clear. We have in Malaysia, for instance, there's actually a lobby of people who are opposed to the fact that the lockdown ended on Monday. Now, there are two types of criticisms. One is that the end of the lockdown was not well planned, and that is a fair criticism in my view. But the other type of criticism is that we have not brought the level of infections and the level of down to a level which justifies ending the lockdown. I have a great deal to say about the details as far as Malaysia is concerned. But I think it is important to recognize that unless there are positive incentives for the population at large to cooperate with the authorities, including the health authorities, I find it very difficult to imagine how lockdowns can be effective in the longer term. Unless you are able to induce and motivate voluntary efforts to, for example, practice physical distancing, to use masks and so on and so forth, it is extremely difficult, in my mind, to sustain the purpose of a lockdown, especially after the lockdown has ended. So I think this is why I emphasize the not only the Kerala experience, but also the Argentinian experience. And I should emphasize also that both Vietnam and Korea have also involved. In Vietnam, they compared the fight against COVID-19 to the Tet Offensive of 1968, which basically turned around the Vietnam War, as you know. So the significance of that kind of analogy, of that kind of comparison, was very, very great to any Vietnamese who knows anything about their own country's history. In the case of Korea, there has been tremendous transparency, tremendous engagement of the whole of government. So one of the things I have been emphasizing is what we call an all-of-government approach in order to ensure a whole-of-society mobilization against COVID-19. This, of course, is easier said than done, but I think creating the conditions for that to work is extremely important, and paying specific attention to particular problems, such as, for example, livelihoods, such as the problems of the residential conditions in slum communities, and so on and so forth. How do you sustain physical distancing when people are cramped? A whole family is staying essentially in one room, and sometimes more than one family, and so on. So all these things, there is very, very little attention, and the emphasis has been simply on repression, on draconian measures, and so on, which I think will ultimately not contribute to sustaining the intended effects of a lockdown.
Jomo, there are actually quite a few questions on different countries that you've talked about, and some about parts of the world that you've not talked about, but let's see. So one is, do you have any comments on the policy responses from sub-Saharan Africa? Are there any gaps, any successes, and where is sub-Saharan Africa going? The other one question is about the Southeast Asian countries. Why is it that so many Southeast Asian countries are in a better position than other parts of the world? Is it because of a particular trajectory of development of capitalism in that region. Yeah. And then there is a question about Argentina. How effective could an SDR, special drawing rights allocation, be to combat COVID-induced financial crisis in Argentina? What could be the possible concerns in ensuring effective implementation of that? And then there is a question on the United States. Yesterday, US President had termed the COVID crisis as bigger attack than Pearl Harbor. He was directly, indirectly attacking China. According to him, China could have stopped this virus within its boundaries. What's your view on that? And finally, what do you think are the possibilities for global cooperation over containing this contagion and its socioeconomic impacts?
Okay, that's quite a bit. Let me try. Sorry, can you just repeat the last one because I didn't quite appreciate that.
The global possibilities of global cooperation for containing this pandemic and its impacts, socioeconomic impacts.
Right. Let me begin with the last one first because it is, in a sense, the most important issue going forward. Unfortunately, we have a divided world, and we have the dominant power in the world almost committed to undermining multilateralism, including multilateralism in organizations we don't particularly sympathize with. I mean, the US has been undermining the WTO, okay? And has been doing so not just under Mr. Trump, but has been doing so even under President Obama, if not even before that. So we have a situation where this idea of American sovereigntism has taken hold. At the end of the Cold War, this became a very powerful part of the American identity of itself. Ironically, this was a time when the US economy started to decline. At the very moment the US economy was going to decline, there was this feeling, this sentiment of American power, of a shared American power during the 1990s. And this was, of course, fostered not only by the Republicans, but also, so we have a huge problem on our hands. And the Democrats, for example, have been very, very insistent on finding external enemies, almost as insistent as Trump has been. First, not only by insisting that the Russians are behind Trump and basically manipulating Trump, and also by joining in with Trump in terms of its anti-China stance. But to put it in larger context, the US is not alone. The US is not alone. It does not have most of Europe behind it on many of these issues, but it has very significant allies elsewhere. Japan has been a very, very important ally. The antagonism between Japan and China goes back many decades, if not centuries. When Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, Japan went out of its way to create a successor arrangement called the CPTPP. And the CPTPP has basically, Prime Minister Abe has tried many a time to try to get the American involvement. Japan has been very much supportive of Taiwanese efforts. By the way, I think it's very important to acknowledge that Taiwan has dealt with COVID-19 rather well. Having said that, however, there is a very clear campaign going on among these circles to basically portray China as behind sort of a conspiracy, so to speak, against the rest of the world with COVID-19. And there are a great number of supporters. Even in Australia, for instance, there have been a number of supporters, although Australia has recently had to the government has had to retract its position slightly because it is so heavily dependent on China economically. So the US is not alone. And as I mentioned earlier, the Indian media, at least the clips I get of Indian television news, basically contribute to this hysteria. Now, on the other side, you have pro-China elements who insist that all this is a US conspiracy. The scientific evidence so far does not lend itself to supporting either view of a Chinese conspiracy or a US conspiracy. This appears to be a naturally occurring virus. Mutations are very common in nature. Whether or not it originates in bats, as some Indians have been insisting, is very unclear. Frankly, but nonetheless, I think the fact that it is naturally occurring is the current scientific consensus until otherwise. I think, given the amount of claims and counterclaims which are being made, it is very important for us to investigate this matter thoroughly. But it's not a matter of great urgency, and given that it's an election year. And Trump was initially doing very well as COVID-19 broke on the American front. Trump was enjoying unprecedented approval ratings. In the last few weeks, his ratings have been slipping quite badly. So I personally view this as just a desperate effort by a desperate politician, but because of the prestige and influence and the soft power the US has, its implications for the rest of the world and for the thinking of international elites, including national elites, is tremendous. So part of the reason why the rest of the world outside of East Asia and Kerala as simply a choice between lockdown and doing nothing. Whereas early action is very much an option as I tried to argue earlier. Now, the more serious problem, of course, is that a number of multilateral organizations are being undermined in the process. The World Health Organization, you know about, and a number of other, as I mentioned, the WTO itself has been undermined for years now, and a number of other organizations have, when an organization is allowed to be led by somebody from the South, as in the case of the WTO, you know that it is no longer part of hegemonic interests. Now, so I think what the problem right now is that we can all wish for a better world with better institutions and much more accountable institutions, but for the time being, we have to live with the world which we have, and this is where I think the global we have to work within work with the multilateral organizations, push them to its limits, as you know that we try to do while working in the United Nations system. And this is still important for us to do. But at the same time, if we eschew those options, then I think the other option really is not really anarchy, but rather direct hegemony, direct rule of the world by certain powers. And given the current ideology of the regime in Washington, this has ominous implications for the rest of us. We are not talking about a Rooseveltian post-war world. We're not talking about a Marshall Plan world. We're not talking about anything remotely addressing that. And even if the Democrats were to come into office after November, for instance, it's not clear how much will really change. The presumption of American hegemony, the presumption of American superiority is still extremely strong. I have lived there in the United States for about 15 years of my life as a student and as a UN official. And, I was shocked by the kind of, I lived during the final years of the Vietnam War when there was a great deal of doubt. But when I was living there as a UN official, I must say that this presumption after the end of the Cold War of American superiority was very, very strong. Now, let me use that to go to the question about the IMF before talking about the US. As far as the IMF is concerned, I happen to be at the UN and representing the UN in the Bretton Woods institutions discussions. I mean, we had no voice, so we had no real say, so to speak, but we were there. And I must say that the new managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, who interestingly did her undergraduate work at the Karl Marx University in Sofia, Bulgaria. She has approached her responsibilities in a refreshingly open way and recognized the unusual nature of this particular crisis. She has not fallen into the trap of dealing with it as any other crisis. She has been much more open than any recent managing director to quite a number of issues, including debt forgiveness and so on and so forth. So I think that at least as far as her leadership is concerned, I'm actually quite pleasantly surprised. Having said that, the IMF's role is not determined by the managing director. The IMF's role is determined by its principal shareholders, and its principal shareholders are going to ensure that the IMF continues to serve their interests. And this basically are the OECD economies, and we cannot expect that to change. Now, so as far as the special drawing rights are concerned, of course, my former colleague and boss, who has written a number of editorials on how SDRs can be used. I have always encouraged him to use every opportunity to promote the idea of SDRs, and I will continue to do so and encourage him to do so. SDRs are not going to be the solution to anything in this, especially in the present situation. The nature of this crisis is so unusual that we have to not just think about the role of aggregate demand or about finance oiling the machinery of the economy, but we really have to think about what it will mean for us to live for an unspecified period of time to come while trying to take precautionary measures such as physical distancing and so on and so forth. What all this will mean for the changed nature of work. And we already know that supply chains have been massively disrupted. Those of us who are more autarkically inclined have already been advocating that economies should be self-reliant. But the options available for China and India are very, very different from the options available to a country like Malawi. So we really have to be sensitive to the variety of circumstances in the South and not dream of a one-size-fits-all type of a solution. We need to be sensitive to how different our conditions are, and that any purported solutions have to be dealt with accordingly. One of the things which a number of people have observed so far in the recent past, has been the fact that there has been a greater degree of mechanization and even automation in industrial and other related processes. My concern is that this will be accelerated. Not only will supply chains be less transnational and more national, but there is going to be a simultaneous tendency towards encouraging mechanization and automation, much of which, fortunately, labor displacing in the short term. I think many of the implications of this are extremely important, particularly for economies such as those in Southeast Asia, which have become quite successfully much more export-oriented and much more integrated into international supply chains. Those international supply chains are going to change very, very fundamentally, and it's not clear yet what is likely to come out of this. And it will be, and what we are likely to see is there'll be very little incentive for countries to cooperate. Even solidarity of the South remains weak on many fronts, as we all know, and it's not clear that this will be strengthened by this crisis. Now, let me go back to the question of the US, just to emphasize the disinformation, which has been which has been so influential. Many of you know from Professor Neil Ferguson, the historian, the right-wing historian, originally Scottish, I think, but now living at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Ferguson used to sing the praises to what he called chimerica, a close relationship between China and America. Now he is the advocate of almost U.S., China, and he has presenting false information, has actually misled the world by claiming that there were flights from Wuhan to much of the rest of the world, and that 4 to 5 million venerable Indian economists have been quoting this number. 4 to 5 million people from Wuhan were ostensibly traveling to the rest of the world during this period. Wuhan has a population of about 20 plus million. Most of them are industrial workers. I cannot imagine 4 to 5 million people traveling all over the world during this 3-week period, which is being claimed. But nonetheless, very venerable people with PhDs behind their names and so on are repeating these claims, which are completely unfounded. And a man who has the unfortunate name of Daniel Bell, a professor of political philosophy and politics, who currently works in China, has actually showed how misleading Ferguson has been and how disingenuous he has been when his errors were pointed out to him, that in fact the flights which he claimed were taking place had actually all been cancelled. Ferguson just ignored this evidence and allowed the lies which he has been perpetuating to continue. But Indian television media has also been repeating many of these claims which are coming from Ferguson and so on. So I don't even know where to attribute blame for all this. Let me quickly go to Southeast Asia. There are many things I don't understand, and I don't claim to understand. And even when I ask my epidemiology friends and others, there are many things which we just don't understand. In Thailand, for example, infection rates, death rates have been relatively low. And Thailand is Bangkok is a very major hub for international travel. How these numbers have been kept so low, I just simply don't know. Perhaps it's serendipitous, it's just luck. Maybe there are other factors. I have argued that part of the reason why much of sub-Saharan Africa has been less infected, either possibly, besides the lack of testing, it might well be the case that sub-Saharan Africa has been less infected simply because it is much less well connected in terms of passenger air travel. So passenger air travel may well be a very important factor, as it was in other parts of the world, Singapore, for instance. But as far as why Thailand is not been worse affected, I simply do not have the answer. As far as the other countries are concerned, as I said, it really depends on the country. Vietnam has done very well for the reasons which we discussed earlier. But Indonesia, for example, has done very, very little testing. And now there are great fears that the situation in Indonesia has really, gone out of control. So we we can attribute the seemingly good situation in Indonesia to lack of inadequate testing. But I think it's also important to remember that all over the world we have con men. They're mainly men, so I think it's it's not being gender biased to say con men. There are con men who are now trying to make a fast buck from other people's distress. And so in Indonesia, for example, with the help of the Japanese government, has been promoting a product which initially got some endorsement from some Chinese doctors. A product which was manufactured by Fujifilm. As you all know, Kodak closed down, but Fujifilm continues to exist, and they make a number of other products. And this product called Avigen was sold. The idea was sold to President Jokowi of Indonesia. He ordered 2 million of this Avigen treatments, and he proudly announced that that Indonesia was basically, I'm trying to translate the word, basically not vulnerable, precisely because they had enough of this ostensible cure. It turned out to be bogus, and there are any number of people who are now following some Indian homeopathic medicine person who's about how to drink coconut oil in certain quantities and so on and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of snake oil salesperson. I don't think the homeopathic doctor stands to profit personally from it, but we have a lot of in this age of social media. There is a great deal of, unfortunately, it lends itself to a great deal of misinformation. I've already said something about sub-Saharan Africa. I just want to underscore that I really don't know why sub-Saharan Africa does not seem to have been terribly infected. I want to highlight the efforts of Senegal, which seems to be doing quite well, and part of it is, I think, due to the woman who might become the next president of Senegal. She has been very proactive in terms of bringing certain proactive measures, early action measures in the case of Senegal. But they contrast that with South Africa. The situation seems to be far worse. It's difficult to generalize about sub-Saharan Africa, but we also do know that there's very little testing. But thankfully, if my hunch is correct that passenger air travel has something to do with it, the fact that it's so difficult to get to many sub-Saharan African capitals may have actually worked perversely in their favor for this, in this instance. Let me stop here. I've taken a bit more time than I had planned.
Yeah. Yeah, but Jomo, before we close, I have to get you to tell us your views about what this means for food insecurity in the world, for nutrition, and what can be done to minimize the adverse implications of this for food security and possibility of worsening malnutrition in the world as a whole. Thanks.
Well, I suspect the three areas three supply chains which are going to be most affected in the aftermath of this are going to be food, medical products, and possibly energy. For very different reasons, as you can imagine. And the prospects for energy, in particularly oil, are very, very uncertain. Prices have been low, and it's unclear what is likely to happen. Some of it, of course, was due to the Russian Saudi issue earlier in the year, and so on and so forth. But as far as food is concerned, I think there will be, interestingly, far greater interest in promoting food self-sufficiency. As you know, food security means different things to different people, and it's not necessarily clear that food self-sufficiency in and of itself is necessarily going to improve food security, especially for the poor. So I think we really need to think of this complex of issues in this connection. Some of my friends have said to me that they are eating better than ever, meaning that they're not going out to eat, not going out to have fast food, and the local equivalents of fast food, which are invariably deep fried food. And this has improved some of the nutrition indicators and so on. But we are talking really in this instance about the middle class. For a lot of poorer people, they have been, their incomes are down. On the first day, on Monday, when the movement control order was lifted, there were longer queues outside pawn shops than any other shops. Okay, it shows you the amount of financial distress people have been put into due to the financial crisis. A person whom I know told me that even the thug who usually comes to collect money from him every week basically said to him, gave him a dispensation, that no payments are due until things get a little better. So I think what all this basically means is that, food security, for the vast majority of people in the world, they do not produce their own food. And what this basically means is going to be quite different with supply chains becoming much more national. I suspect in countries like China and India, supply chains will become much more national. Vietnam, for example, a very major rice exporter, threatened to cut its rice exports and give priority to its own population. So we are going to see a greater degree of concern about securing food supplies. And this is probably going to result in far greater attention to food self-sufficiency and related supply side incentives. How this is going to affect food security for the poor is going to be a very, very complex issue. It will depend very much on the nature of the incentives which are provided and so on. And in all too many societies, it is very likely that the big farmers and even agribusiness are going to be the major beneficiaries of the new supply side incentives, so to speak, for producing more food at the national level. And it's unclear how food security, what food security will mean for many farmers. The food sovereignty movement, of course, as you know, has been would like a particular outcome, but there's no reason to presume that that is guaranteed in these circumstances. Now, as far as nutrition is concerned, one of the major problems is that that the attention given to nutrition, and particularly forms of malnutrition which are not outright hunger, has been very low. We have, as you know, well over 2 billion people in a world population of 7.5 billion, well over 2 billion people who are overweight, a third of whom are medically obese. We have a huge number of micronutrient deficiencies, not only of vitamins and minerals, but also trace elements, which are manifest in many, many different ways in terms of people's health. And then we have new conditions because of the increasing reliance on herbicides and agrochemicals and so on. We also find that there are that food safety is becoming a major concern. And the excessive use of, for example, antibiotics in the production of animal foods, whether fish or meat, is a matter of grave concern. So there are a whole range of issues which need to come into the conversation around food security. And I would like to think that we might have a favorable outcome with greater interest in food self-sufficiency at the national level, but this is not far from assured, and even some of the intergovernmental discussions are not going to get very far. But you should know that the high-level political forum of the United Nations has put food security and nutrition at the top of its agenda in the forthcoming meeting. But what this means is very unlikely to be, we're not clear, because as you know, in such circumstances, we find that without participating in a face-to-face meetings, you're going to be participating like this through other types of means of communication. And so the ministers who rarely take these issues too seriously, except when they have to speak, are probably not even going to pay much attention to these international forums. So ultimately, we think how the discourse changes at the national level, and perhaps at the state level, the regional level, and so on and so forth, may be decisive in terms of answering the question which you have just posed.
Thank you, Jomo. Thank you for this very informative talk. But more than that, thank you for taking all these interesting questions that went beyond the talk, and our audience decided that they're going to pick on your brains and get you to answer, talk about a lot of other things that you are obviously best placed to do. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jomo, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Vikas, and thanks to the audience for staying to the very end.